distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, may I welcome you very warmly to this evening, to the Danube Institute, and to an occasion that is, I believe, will be not only significant intellectually, but also, I think, joyful in spirit. I'm gathered here for the premiere screening of a remarkable new documentary based on a book by a remarkable man, our colleague Rod Dreher. Rod is not only a best-selling author and an incisive cultural critic, but the director of our network project at the Institute, through which he has created vital bridges with the religious and moral communities throughout Central and Eastern Europe and beyond. The film you're about to see, Live Not by Lies, produced by Angel Studios, was recently introduced at its world premiere in Washington by none other than Vice President J.D. Vance. So it's fitting then that in Budapest, where we don't have a vice president in Hungary, I think, but we have its nearest equivalent in Dr. Balázs Orbán, the political director to the Prime Minister, and I should add, I think, here, a long-time friend of this institute, in fact, from the very first year. I don't wish on this occasion to make exaggerated claims for the Danube Institute, but I will allow myself this brief observation. I note that 3 current members of the US State Department's Policy Planning Department are former Danube Institute fellows. So there used to be a famous newspaper ad that said, "I got my job through the New York Times." I think we should amend it these days to "I got it through the Danube Institute." Now, it's my pleasure, therefore, on this occasion, to hand over to Dr. Orbán to offer his remarks and to kick off this important evening. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it looks like it's my task today to say a few words about Rod Dreher and the impact he has had. Over the years, I developed a kind of method for moments like this. The idea is very simple. If you try to understand the deeper impact of someone's work, it's worth turning to those who have spent serious time thinking about what makes someone truly great. The German philosopher Hegel, for example, spoke of world historical figures, people who, while following their own convictions, end up moving history forward. Hegel's example was Napoleon, who aimed to elevate France, but in doing so spread legal reforms that shaped Europe's idea of freedom. Today, I think we honor someone who may be completely opposite of Napoleon in character, but whose work has had a similar impact. Rod Dreher, through his writings and actions, has helped shift the course of our time, perhaps more than even he intended. Rod's historical achievement is that through his writings and personal example, he played a key role in breathing new life into the American conservative movement. For a time, that movement had shown signs of running out of steam, but Rod and some others helped prove that it could still be renewed and re-energized. He gave fresh momentum to conservative thought in the United States by revealing something many had sensed, but few had dared to say out loud, that the dominant progressive ideologies of our time, especially wokeism and gender theory, carry within them the seeds of a new kind of totalitarianism. By doing so, Rod and others who stood alongside him helped trigger a major shift in American political life. Nothing shows this more clearly than Rod's key role in launching the career of J.D. Vance, now Vice President, rising star of conservative American movement. But it's not only America that owes Rod a debt of gratitude. We Hungarians do as well. Rod played an important role in helping us shape our new approach to relations with the United States. I first had a long conversation with Rod at the Hungarian launch of the Benedict option hosted by the Matthias Corvinus Collegium. That's when he told me that Tucker Carlson has interested in Hungary and wanted to visit. He just needed a personal contact to make it happen. The rest, as they say, is history. Today, we can say that relations between the United States and Hungary are stronger than ever before. And Rod played a key role in making that happen. We are grateful to him for building a bridge between the two, by instinct, I think, sovereign and conservative nation. So, dear friends, allow me to say a few more words about the shared history of these two countries. America and Hungary have long been connected by shared love of freedom. Hungarian hussars fought with George Washington, and in 1848 the US Congress supported Hungary's struggle. An American steamboat brought Lajos Kossuth out of exile, and today his statue stands in the Congress. The 20th century took us in different directions. We stood on opposite sides in both World Wars and in the Cold War. Afterward, we became allies again, but the partnership became increasingly difficult as America has ruled by globalist liberal forces. The recent shift in Washington has now made it possible for us to again re-energize this alliance, not just politically or strategically, but also on a civilizational level. We now stand on the foundation of shared values, values that can bring us together for a long term. We both reject transnational power structures and stand firmly for national sovereignty. We both believe in the family as a cornerstone of a society. We are aware of and committed to our Christian civilizational roots, and we have both come to understand that illegal migration poses a deep threat to the integrity of our communities. This bond, I think, matters, not just for today, but because the task we share is of world historical significance. The new era has begun in global affairs as well. For the first time in its history, at least in a history of the 20th and 21st century, United States sees the current international order as working against its interest and leading it toward decline. Washington is now seeking to move beyond the liberal frameworks that once shaped the global system and to build something new, something it sees as a model for the future. Ladies and gentlemen, Rod Dreher has once again done a great service, not just in America and not just to America, but to the world. The status quo that the United States now sees as working against its interest is, at its core, a progressive liberal one. And progressive liberalism now closely resembles the old communism we knew in Central Europe. Rod's book and the documentary film based on it help us see this clearly. Through personal stories and real-life experiences, he shows how today's liberals have come to resemble the communists of the past. One story stayed with me. The Czechoslovak priest imprisoned for his faith ending up sharing a cell with his former torturer, a common twist under communism. That torturer asked him to pray for his soul. The priest spoke of it without bitterness, even with quite joy, capturing the absurdity of the communist regime. And I must say the story hit close to home. Something very similar happened in my own family. My grandmother was imprisoned by the feared Hungarian secret police in 1949. He spent months in prison without knowing what would happen to her. Then one day the guard told her that someone in a neighboring cell wanted to speak to her. It turned out that the man in the next cell, prison cell, had, until the day before, been the head of guards for the entire prison. He informed her that she would be sentenced to 8 years, of which she ended up serving 4. Like the Czechoslovak priest. My grandmother told her story with humor and grace. She laughed at the absurdity of the regime that ended up imprisoning innocent people who politically disagreed with them. I think nothing shows the difference between the totalitarian left and the national conservative right more clearly than this. There are two common observations in Hungary that relate to this. The political right here in Hungary often says of itself, even those who don't vote for us end up better off. The same can hardly be said about the political left. In fact, with them, even their own voters tend to lose. And, as we like to add, you can only vote for them once because they will likely cancel the elections. So, Rod, once again, thank you for reminding us of this, and thank you for showing the reality of totalitarian regimes to the world and to the American and European audience. This is a lesson we should all keep in mind because totalitarian trends on the left are resurfacing around the world. It's the same playbook all over again. To me, that's the film's most important message. So we should not let it happen again. Thank you very much for coming to today's event, and thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you, Balázs. That was an incredible introduction, and it makes me think of something that my son said when he was in high school. He was asked by one of his classmates, "What is it like to have a father who is a best-selling writer?" He said, "Oh, it's nothing. I've seen him in his underwear." It is a real honor to present this documentary to you all. This is the first audience inside the former communist world that will have seen this film. I'm honored as well to have two people here today who are part of the book, my friend Anna Shai and her father Tomasz. You'll see Anna later on stage. The idea for the book came in 2015 when I received a phone call one day in Louisiana where I was living from a man named Dr. John Scherger. He was a cardiologist at the Mayo Clinic, prestigious hospital in the Midwest. And he reached out to me as a stranger because he said, "I have to tell a journalist what just happened." His elderly mother lived there with him and his wife. She was born in Czechoslovakia, as his father was. And during the 1950s, she spent 6 years in a communist prison after being convicted for being a Vatican spy. What made her a spy? They told her stop going to church, and she wouldn't. So they put her in prison and tortured her. After she was released from prison, she came to America. Dr. Scherger's mother and father married, and he was born in the U.S. Now, this was 2015, at the very end of her life, she said, "Son, the things that are happening in this country, America now, remind me of what Czechoslovakia was like when the communists first came to power." And this was at the rise of wokeness, right? It was just really starting to get going. And I thought, that's a little bit extreme. My mom watches a lot of cable news, and she's old, and she gets very paranoid about the world. So I made a point when I would travel around the U.S., if I would meet people who had come to America from the Soviet Union or the Soviet bloc, I would just say to them, are the things you're seeing happen in America now with the rise of wokeness, cancel culture, and so forth, does it remind you of what you left behind? Every single one of them said yes. And if you would talk to them long enough, they would talk about how angry they were that Americans wouldn't take them seriously. So eventually I decided this is a story that needed to be told. In the book I wrote, Live Not by Lies, that's a quote from Solzhenitsyn. In the first part of the book, I talk about how wokeness is a form of totalitarianism, but a softer form of it than the hard totalitarianism of the Soviet years. And that accounts for the fact that we Americans can't see it. We think of totalitarianism as having gulags, secret police, breadlines, and all of the things that we know from the Soviet past. Well, we don't have those in America today, at least not yet, so how is this totalitarianism? Well, you'll see part of the answer in this film, and we'll talk about that in the discussion after the film. The second part of the book, Live Not by Lies, involved me traveling throughout the former Soviet bloc, talking to men and women, Christians, who had suffered under communism. Some of them went to jail, and asking them, what advice would you have for we living in the West today about how to identify totalitarianism and how to resist it? And their stories make up the second part of the book. I first came to Hungary in 2019, researching the book here, and that's when I fell in love with this country, and I ended up moving here in 2022. I'm very happy to be here because I know that Central Europe, the former communist countries, have an important message for the rest of the West today. I should say before I turn it over to the film that when this book came out, Live Not by Lies, it came out in September of 2020 in the US. Most of my books usually have a lot of media coverage. This got nothing, no coverage at all. And it's not hard for me to understand why, because I was calling out the sacred cows of the American media, race, gender, sex, all of this, and the way they run the system. I was calling it out as totalitarian, and they didn't want to hear it. Nevertheless, the book sold by word of mouth over 200,000 copies. It sold that because the book happened to have come out. I didn't plan this, but it came out after 6 months of COVID and after the summer of George Floyd, which resulted in race riots and American companies, universities, and so forth, instituting stone-cold racist policies to try to show equity, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Ordinary Americans knew that something big was happening, but they didn't know why. This book and the stories that people who came to America from this part of the world and could recognize what was happening, this book, their stories, explained it to Americans. The book went on to be translated into, I think, 11 languages now, including Hungarian. You can find a Hungarian copy of this in your bookstores. They decided to make this film 2 years ago, and I have to say, I'm in the film, and I helped the producers and the director meet some people, make some connections over here, but I didn't direct the film, and I didn't write the film. I say that because you won't, there are 4 episodes in the film. You can see the last 3 on angel.com. That's angel.com. You have to pay something to watch them, but trust me, it's worth it. I say that, though, to protect myself because Hungary is not in this film. And the reason is not anti-Hungarian. The reason is the production company ran out of money before they could come to Hungary to do the film. So but if this is a success, we're going to make part 2. And I will insist that Hungary be part of this from the beginning. Anyway, with no further ado, let me turn the program over to the film. The director, Isaiah Smallman, is a very talented young American. He will be joining us later after the film by video connection to discuss it. Thank you all very much, and here's Live Not by Lies, Episode 1. And we will be joined in a moment by Isaiah Smallman, who's back home in Tennessee in the U.S., and he'll be participating in the discussion. I want to start, though, Anna, by explaining why you're here. You and I, together, back in 2019, discovered the core of soft totalitarianism, what makes it different from the Soviet version, the hard version. Anna was my interpreter as I was traveling through Budapest, interviewing people who had lived through communism. And we were on the tram at Székely, I remember, and you said to me that you, as a Catholic and as a mother and a wife, you were having so much trouble talking even to your Catholic friends about your everyday struggles, in your marriage, as a mom, ordinary things. You said as soon as you would say that you are struggling, like my husband and I are not getting along, something completely ordinary, They would cut you off and say, oh, you have to get a divorce. Put your son in daycare. Go back to the office. You have to be happy. And you didn't understand that. And I said, Anna, it sounds like you're fighting for your right to be unhappy. Do you remember what you said?
No, help me out,
I do,
please.
I do. It's in the book.
It's in the
You
book.
said, that's it. Where did you get that? And I said, it's in chapter 17 of Aldous Huxley's book, Brave New World. And in that chapter, the world controller for Europe, Mustafa Mond, brings the one dissident from their utopia in to see him. Now, in Orwell's 1984, when the dissident Winston Smith is brought in, they torture him to make him love Big Brother. In Huxley's version, though, he just wants to find out, why wouldn't you want to be part of this society? John the Savage is the dissident's name. Because in this society, in Huxley's version, the government gives you everything you want. They give you a house, they give you all the entertainment you want, they give you happy pills called soma, they give you all the sex, all the pornography, everything is provided. He calls it Christianity without tears. And Mustafa wants to know, why won't you join it? And what we find out in their exchange is that John the Savage, who has been raised outside the society, reading nothing but the works of Shakespeare, he believes that suffering is part of what it means to make us human. That's how we become human. And he says, I think you could all do, Mustafa Mond, with a little more suffering in this society. And Mustafa Mond says, it sounds like you're fighting for your right to be unhappy. And he says, okay, I am. And I'm fighting for love, and I'm fighting for God, and I'm fighting for music, and I'm fighting for sin, and all of the things that make us human. Mustafa Mond says, you're welcome to it, and sends him away. Now, I think this was so important. This is why our discussion on the tram that day was so important, because it seems to me that soft totalitarianism is something people accept, because today, in our very comfortable society, they're terrified of suffering, even small suffering, like anxiety.
Yes. Thank you so much for having me, first of all. It's an honor to be here. Yes, I remember the conversation on the tram. I was thinking, before coming here, I was thinking about the documentary, of course, and its message to present-day Hungarians. And I think my view is that maybe Hungary and Eastern Central Europe is somewhat resistant to wokeness as it was or is in the West, especially in the United States. There are a lot of reasons for that. One, I think, is that to me, it seems to be a uniquely American Puritan phenomenon, but this might be part of a bigger discussion. Nonetheless, we cannot be complacent, I think, we Hungarians and people of Eastern or Central Europe, because this kind of soft totalitarianism that your book is about and that the documentary is about is indeed creeping on us. And I think a lot about how it's going to come to my country. And yes, the main avenue I see is the therapeutic one, which in your work you talk about this a lot. You focus on the triumph of the therapeutic and how my poor friends would be offended, by the way, I'm quite sure, by this characterization. But yes, it is indeed, I find it as a millennial mother and wife and person, I find it a struggle to speak about with my contemporaries about the difficulties of life. There seems to be a great fear of suffering.
And they
despair, even, I would say. Despair.
Yeah, and this is absolutely the case in the U.S. Oh, there's Isaiah. Can we bring him up on screen? I see him there. There you are, Isaiah. Can you hear us?
I can hear you. Thanks for having me.
Great, great. We're just talking about soft totalitarianism and the fear of suffering. In the United States, the anxiety among the younger generations, the millennials and Generation Z, the one after that, is completely off the charts. And what wokeness has done is it has redefined mere anxiety as suffering. So you get the case where you have the transgender movement. We saw here at the Danube Institute an excellent film by Travis Brown, an American filmmaker, about transgenderism in children. The doctors and the advocates for cutting the breast off of children, mutilating them with chemistry, they say, well, we have to give them that or the kids will commit suicide. And so you have these totalitarian insanities that are pushed on all of society for therapeutic reasons, so people will feel comfortable.
Yes, and I would just like to add one more thing. Also, when I was thinking about what to talk about when I'm here today, this sounds quite provocative, I know, but I do think that many of the objectives of communism were achieved what came afterwards. So here in Hungary, we lived under communism and we lived under what came afterwards, whatever we would like to name it, capitalism or liberalism, you name it. And it achieved, I think, more successfully the objectives of communism than communism did in many ways. People who are a bit older here, I'm sure remember they used to sing a song called the Internationale. And this is a song that ends with, and the world will be international. Well, it's been achieved a lot more successfully than under communism.
Globalism.
Globalism, yes. The severing of ties, family ties to your nation, it's been achieved a lot more successfully than under communism. You do not need to spy on anyone. You do not need to intercept phone calls. People are giving away extremely personal information, willingly, more than willingly. So I am of the view that whatever communism was, and as we experienced it here in Hungary, whatever came afterwards, is not really in antagonism to one another. Rather, again, the objectives are quite similar. The one big difference, of course, is the material comfort that we have. But I would argue that this is something that is achieved by ways of having a lot of debt, individually and collectively. And probably you would agree with me that having a lot of debt is not exactly the pinnacle of freedom either.
No. Isaiah, let's turn to you. You're talking to what I believe is the first audience in a former communist country to see the film that you've made. Could you share with them what it was like for you as an American to come over here, to meet these people, to hear their stories? How did it change you?
Yeah, thanks again for having me, everyone. And what an honor to get to make this film. And, I've been nervous. I'll start at the beginning. I was really nervous for a number of reasons. I was a little scared I was going to get canceled for making this, and I wasn't quite ready to do that. I eventually decided to throw that caution to the wind and do what my heart was telling me I needed to do. But it changed me in all sorts of ways. I think one of the most important continues to percolate inside of me. Editing something like this is the first of 4. It's a big undertaking. It's hard, I put it in quotes only because I'll sometimes be sitting here, working and feeling sorry for myself because I'm tired or whatever. And someone I'm working, editing will come on screen and talk about real suffering with a smile and with this joy that they have because they've accepted it as part of God's will for their lives. And it just, every time it would just hit me like a ton of bricks. I realized, wow, I'm trying really hard to disentangle myself from this worldview that I need to be comfortable and happy all the time in order for my life to make sense. And even I'm sitting here working on a project about it. And I still get wrapped up in it. And so it was a real gift to kind of have that constant reminder over a long period of time that not only is my life great, and there are lots of material things that are great about it, but that I could live without those things, and that ultimately I have to just learn how to accept that life is about more than that. And so that was one way it changed me, and getting to meet people firsthand who, again, lived that and continue to live it, and no one regretted standing up for doing the right thing. No one regretted that we talked to, putting their family in a difficult position, any of that, to stand up for truth. That was, again, another thing. And here I am again thinking maybe I won't even work on this project because what if it's awkward? What if my family, and I still continue to have certain conversations that are kind of annoying. I'm like, why do we have to keep talking about how you don't love the fact that I'm working on this project? I did it and I'm proud of it. But that's so minor, and yet it still is, it's hard. It's if I'm honest, it's still kind of annoying, and it's a deterrent, and it's amazing how deeply rooted it's become. So that idea of that willingness to suffer continues to change me, and the willingness to just even endure awkwardness with people who disagree with you in order to facilitate conversations. That's something I'm really, frankly, bad at, and this project has challenged me to make that a real priority to work on.
Isaiah, one thing that's really interesting is you're talking about how you were afraid we're going to get canceled in the United States for working on this. And that's a sign that you don't have to have an all-powerful government to have totalitarian conditions. And I think that's one way that soft totalitarianism differs from hard totalitarianism. Nobody in the U.S. government is going to punish you for making this film. But the people in the filmmaking community, those who head up cultural institutions and so on and so forth, they might inflict real career suffering on you for daring to make this film.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I really took heart in, especially after I learned more about it, was part of the way that we combat that is by working with people who do believe that the truth is important, and building communities that can withstand that type of pressure. And so for me, that looks like finding kindred spirits like you, Rod, and saying, let's have a partnership. Let's make things that we're excited about, because if I go it alone, then I eventually will either end up bankrupt or giving in. Those are really kind of the two options, versus saying, let me find people who believe in the right thing and preserving the truth and making this kind of stuff. Let's work together, and we can actually do something that's really impactful and really interesting. And so I think the fact that this film is here is a testament. I mean, we didn't have any international investors just because of legal requirements on our end, but just within the U.S., we had 2,800 people invest anywhere from $100 to $25,000, invest money in this project to get it made. Almost 3,000 people who not only believe in it, but are actually believing in it enough to send us money to make it. And so it is, on one hand, very real. I do have to kind of be very aware of what it is doing to my career. And at the same time, there are lots of people who don't care. And they believe in this, and they want to make it happen. And I think facilitating the community building around those ideas is super important.
Yeah, the question of community is hugely important to resistance. In the first episode, the one we just saw, you talk about, Isaiah, in your narration, about how Václav Benda and Camilla Benda built that community around their little apartment in Prague. And one thing that really sticks out with me about what Camilla told me when I interviewed her for the book, I asked her, I said, you and your husband, your late husband, you were very faithful Catholics. And all of the people you surrounded yourself with, Havel and the others, they were all hippies. They didn't have faith necessarily, and not all of them agreed with you politically. Yet you still formed a fellowship. Was that hard for you? And Camilla said, oh, no, not at all. She said, Rod, you have to understand, when you're facing totalitarianism, the most important quality to look for in other people who are going to be your allies is courage. She said, you mustn't imagine that our fellow Catholics had courage. Most of them did like everybody else did and kept their heads down. But my husband and I knew that we could not stand before God as believing Catholics and keep our mouths shut. But we knew we couldn't do it by ourselves. So when we found other people who had courage, and it turned out to be these hippies, because they knew, the Bendas knew, that if they were arrested and taken to jail, as Václav later was, that they had a community that would look after their children. And the Havels and the others knew that the Bendas would look after their children if the same thing happened to them. Anna, you want to say something?
Yeah, sorry, just to chime in. My one takeaway from this first episode was these people did, I think Camilla talks about how they provided some sort of legal counsel as much as it was possible to anyone who was done wrong by the state. And I think in these stories and many other stories of people who stood up to totalitarianism, they were just ordinary, decent humans, right? They did the decent human thing. And I think this is something that's also very topical today. Some people talk about the times that we're living in and that are coming up being very anti-human. What is it to be human? It's being redefined in many, many ways, most especially by technology. So I think how to be a decent, ordinary human is just as much a challenge today, obviously in other forms, in different ways, than it was for them. So that was one big takeaway for me, and an inspiration as well.
Yeah, and I think it's also important, as Isaiah was alluding to, that none of these dissidents thought they would live to see the end of communism. They took their stand, they accepted suffering because it was the right thing to do. And that is something incredibly heroic. If you go watch the rest of the series on angel.com, in the 4th episode, it focuses toward the end on elderly people, elderly Catholics in Slovakia who had been to prison and some of whom were tortured for their faith, and how that was, for them, among the happiest times of their lives. They didn't want to suffer, God knows, but they found themselves depending so deeply on God, and it affected them the rest of their life. And in fact, the young man who introduced me to their stories, Timo Kriška, he's a young Slovak photographer who grew up, and filmmaker who grew up after communism, and it affected him so much that he decided to go to seminary. He's training to be a Greek Catholic priest now. But that leads me to talk about the role of God in Christianity and all this. So many of the men and women we talk to found in their religious faith the courage and the vision to resist suffering and to refuse to live by lies. What about today, Anna? I mean, here in Hungary, we have lots of freedoms and a strong resistance to wokeness, but religious faith is not very strong, nor is it strong in many of the other countries. In fact, in Poland, it's collapsing in the younger generations.
Yeah, this is, we are living through interesting times, right? Which is a blessing or a curse, depending on which side we look at. Yes, so another objective of communism was the crushing of religious faith. Now, I think the latest big poll, government, state-sponsored poll found that I think 1 million religious believers were lost in Hungary in the past, I don't know, 10 to 15 years, which is a lot, which is really a lot. So there are signs of religious revival in the West, where the situation is in many ways worse than in Hungary. But also there are signs, as your next book focuses on, about people searching for answers in all the wrong places. I really am curious about how this is going to go down in Hungary. Obviously, as a Catholic, I pray and hope for a revival in the Catholic Church. I see a lot of things happening in these sort of neo-Protestant communities that seems to be something very popular with the younger people. Remains to be seen.
But to one of your earlier points, the loss of religious faith has accelerated under capitalism, under freedom, without the government there to suppress it, which is one of these great tragedies of history. And in fact, I think that's why Pope John Paul II was so in so much despair toward the end of his life, because he had hoped for a rebirth of the faith when communism fell, but it really didn't happen.
I would argue it accelerated exponentially, actually. And I think it's also in the book, someone in Slovakia told you that as difficult as communism was, it's more difficult today, because at least then you could perceive what you are fighting against, whereas today it's as if through a fog, a thick fog.
The light of the gospel hits only fog.
Yes, and I think that's very, very true.
Isaiah, what about in our country, the United States? It is much more overtly religious than Central Europe, than certainly more than Western Europe. But one gets the feeling, at least I do as an American Christian, that the faith is pretty shallow, and that if persecution came, a lot of people would fall right in line with whatever the powers wanted them to. Am I wrong about that?
No, I think you're dead on. I mean, if you haven't read Rod's next book, it's a great follow-up to this. I don't think you intended it as a sequel, Rod, but I do think it's sort of to me, it does feel like, okay, here's what totalitarianism looks like when it's totally soft. And to me, what that looks like is religion that comes in and says, religion loosely defined, that comes in and says, yeah, you can have everything you want and have God. And the only God worth serving is ultimately going to ask a lot of you, because that is the path to true freedom. And so I see that in a lot of friends. I mean, I've shared a number of different Q&As that, for me, part of what actually drew me to this project was that 5.5 years ago, I got sober. And to me, that was a moment where I realized, I don't need a government to oppress me. Like, if you give me an opportunity to numb my feelings and numb out my anxiety and self-medicate my way through difficult situations, it's very tempting to do that. And what it, of course, ends up happening is that becomes a prison of its own. And so I think whether it's plant-based religions, if it's, therapeutic sort of new agey religion, if it's UFOs, I mean, everybody's looking for this kind of easy messiah that's going to come in and sort of solve all of their problems. That doesn't work. We had a visiting priest recently. I don't remember how he got on this topic, but somehow what came up was everybody's looking for, how are we going to solve world hunger? How are we going to have peace? How are we going to have all these things? And he's like, that was already offered to us, and we didn't like it because it's hard. It requires self-sacrifice. We have all the answers that we need for utopia in a way. It's God's kingdom. It's just that God's kingdom doesn't. It's on the other side of struggle, and so I think a lot of people, now that sort of the idea, as Solzhenitsyn points out, the idea of communism, some people are still entertaining it, but for the most part, communism seems to have, as he says, it's less than zero as an ideological idea. But the problem is now we have all these other things that come in and say, you can have everything. You can have utopia. We can solve world hunger and all these things, and you can be comfortable in the process. And it's like, man, I don't know. That scares me even more. So, and I see that with countless friends. I mean, every day it comes up in some form or another.
Yeah, when I was in Moscow doing interviews for the book Live Not by Lies, I spent a couple of hours interviewing a very brave Protestant pastor, Yuri Sipko, an elderly Russian Baptist whose father, like all the men in that community, was taken away by Stalin, and they've suffered for decades. At the end of our interview, we walked out onto the street to say goodbye. It was early November. The snow was starting to fall. We were near Red Square. That old man looked at me in the eye, put his finger up, and said, "You go back to America and tell the church that if you're not willing to suffer for your faith is worthless." I mean, he was very blunt about it. And he had the authority to say that because he had lived it. And I try to tell that story when I talk to American audiences about this film, but it's just something that it seems almost incomprehensible because so much of our Christianity is very therapeutic. It's all about taking away anxiety, not learning how to sacrifice and learn how to endure the anxiety and suffering with Christ. And it makes me wonder, the next time a serious totalitarianism comes, what are we, the people, going to draw on for our resistance?
Well, I mean, speaking of what religious faith looks like in the West, you see, in the town I live in Chattanooga, Tennessee, I mean, there are 1 trillion churches around, and almost all of them have some different little super narrowly defined version of what it means to be a Christian. And that's because they just split, and it's like two factions within a church have some slight difference in the way that they think things can be worked out. Well, we're going to go do our own thing. That's that lack of unity, too. It's that isolation. It's that idea that I can't be working with and in close community with people that I disagree with. That's a different type of the comfort that we're seeking. And I agree. What ends up happening is that it becomes, okay, I'll go to this church because it makes me feel good inside, because it's got great production value and all these things. And it's like, okay, that's fine, I guess. But to your point, what's going to happen when someone hurts you, when real struggle comes? It doesn't feel like it has real roots. And again, that's not me. I'm not trying to be judgmental. It's just you see the results of it. It's like people leave. And you see in my little town, you see this church growing, and then something happens and it falls away, and then this next one grows because everyone goes over there because it's better. And I just can't imagine how that could withstand real pressure. It doesn't seem like it would work.
One thing that I learned in doing my research is the importance of maintaining historical and cultural memory to resist totalitarianism. The communists understood very well that if they wanted to control the population, they had to control what was in the school books. They had to erase the memories of each nation so the people would be blank slates that they could impress communist ideology on. Well, I don't just feel like it, I know it's happening in the West today, not only because you have people on the left within educational institutions attacking Western history, Western historical figures, but mostly I think you have widespread indifference to history. In the book, I talk about meeting a young woman in her 20s. I know her family. It was a conservative family, a church-going family, but she said to me, "I'm a communist." I said, "Oh, why is that?" She said, "Well, because I love the idea of world peace and brotherhood and equality, all the usual things." I said to her, "Okay, well, what about the gulags?" She said, "The what?" She had no idea, because she was born after communism ended and nobody ever talked about it in America. You can go on Netflix and find 100 documentaries about the Nazi experience, and that's a good thing. We need to know what happened so we don't repeat it, but almost nothing about communism. So, Anna, what was it like for your post-communist generation here in Hungary?
Yeah, I was just reminded of the Jewish saying, tell your children, right? How very important it is to give the message to the next generation. Now, my father, who is sitting here, he was, I think, maybe 7 years old, so very, very young. And my grandfather sat him down one day when he came home from school, cheerily, happily saying, "Oh, how wonderful it is that we were liberated by the Soviet troops. I mean, isn't it great?" And then he was, again, no older than 7. And my grandfather sat him down and told him, "Look, now I'm going to tell you something. You cannot talk about this at school, but I'm going to tell you how this really was." And he did. And young as he was, he understood the assignment and he understood what was going on. Now, in many families in Hungary, this didn't happen. Balázs Orbán was earlier talking about in his family the partaking of memory and what happened. I think this is really crucial to tell your children. What I've witnessed, though, which is quite a sad side is I've known families where the children, one parent put it to me this way: the contra current was just way too strong. She did tell the children. They did have an alternative worldview, and I've seen many cases where the children chose to believe someone else and not the parents or the grandparents. So I think we cannot underestimate the power of the media and influencers maybe in this day and age. It's very, very strong. If you feel like you have to identify with something that's losing or waning, there are a lot of young people who won't want to do that. So I think that's a real challenge.
Let's turn to the audience for some Q&A. Does anybody have any comments, questions that they would like to ask or state? Just raise your hand.
I'm just wondering about the choice of the Czech Republic and Slovakia. In the case of Slovakia, you had a Catholic fascist dictatorship in Slovakia during the Second World War that committed appalling atrocities, mass murder, etc., led by a Monsignor Josef Tiso. And in the case of the Czech Republic, there's an equally unpleasant history associated post-war, but prior to the Czechoslovakia as it was then, becoming a communist state where leading Christians were involved in massacres of the ethnic German population. So I think it's very convenient for your version of totalitarianism or authoritarianism, or whatever you care to call it, that you would ignore that history and not place these things in a more nuanced context.
Well, how does it negate the evil that was done by communism to focus on that, because that was the leading ideology for much of the 20th century? I'm not trying to say that the right-wing version was any better. I mean, Hitler is in this film, but I was interested when I set out to write the book in focusing on the story that wasn't told, that is not told in the West today, which is the story of communist repression. One thing I admire about the Terror House here in Budapest, it's a museum of the communist oppression, but they also tell the story of the Arrow Cross, the fascists who were in power too. Totalitarianism is totalitarianism. Lately, Isaiah and I were at a screening in the U.S., and someone in the audience said, well, don't you feel good about how the Trump administration is pushing back on wokeness, and finally we're getting somewhere on that? I said, yeah, I'm really happy about that, but we mustn't allow ourselves to think that totalitarianism is just a left-wing thing. After all, Hitler and Stalin were the two avatars of and Mao of totalitarianism in the 20th century, and all of the conditions that Hannah Arendt said are necessary for totalitarianism to rise in a country are still present in America today. I don't want to live under a right-wing totalitarianism any more than I want to live under a left-wing one. So we have to always be vigilant. Somebody else. Nick, right there.
Thank you very much, Rod, and also Isaiah, for an amazing film. I'd like to, and you've partly answered my, question with your answer to the previous one, but I remember sitting around. I'll give you a little anecdote. I remember sitting around a fire with Václav Havel and Jan Langoš, a Catholic dissident, also signature of Charter 77, and another person sitting around the fire was a Czech ballad singer called Vladimir Merta. This was 1991, I think, when Havel was already president. And Merte sang a song about 2 o'clock in the morning called Koniec Experimentu, the end of experiments, the end of the experiment. So from a dissident view, looking back at communism, people were relieved in the early 90s that this was the end of the experiment. And communism as an experiment sort of forced on them from outside. The nature of revolutions, and we have a revolution going on in the United States now. Viktor Orbán came to power in 2010 here, promising a revolution here, is experiment. And it's also about liberation, of course, and I know many people on the right in America feel a kind of liberation from wokeness and so on now. Many people on the conservative right in Hungary felt Viktor Orbán and this government as a kind of liberation, you know, from the liberalism or whatever that had gone before. But the nature of revolutions, I'm afraid, and of experiments, is that after the liberation they turn totalitarian. There are totalitarian elements, and increasingly so. And I just wanted to issue that sort of word of warning, I guess, that, as you just said, the totalitarianism, the cancelling of other views, the cancelling in Hungary today of people critical of the government is not something, the cancelling, for example, of a kindergarten teacher losing her job because she allowed an opposition leader in. There are many elements of this. Thank you.
Okay, well, you'll have a chance to speak. Thank you, Nick. Who else was? Oh, at the top. Yeah.
I just want to make a very brief remark. My friend, Roger Scruton, who is a hero here and in Czechoslovakia and in Poland, just before he died, he wrote an opera called An Angel Passes, or it's actually now called Anna. And when I heard this, a line, it's about dissidents in Prague 4 or 5 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the kind of experience that they're undergoing when Prague becomes this utterly materialistic city, of choice for hen parties and whatnot from England. Anyway, leave that out. But one of the characters sings, "When freedom came, God disappeared." And somebody repeats it and says, "When freedom came, God disappeared." Isn't that strange? That's all.
Do you want to say something? Well, people will have to worship. It's in human nature. One of the things that concerns me about whatever totalitarianism might come next, and it could take many forms, is coming from AI, artificial intelligence. We're already seeing now people developing, at least in the United States, I don't know if it's here, people developing relationships, a simulation of a human relationship with AI lovers. The New York Times has been writing about people, including a married woman, a 28-year-old married woman, who can't get full satisfaction from her husband, so she spends 60 hours a week conversing with Leo, her AI lover. It's also the case that it just reported this week in Rolling Stone magazine in the US that there are people who are falling into AI religions because even though they know, or they should know, that this is just a machine, the machines are so good at simulating being human, and they're so full of knowledge that people treat them as if they were deities. And I think that could go any number of ways, right-wing, left-wing, or maybe not a particularly political way, but it's all a way of surrendering your own independence by outsourcing your thought to this external authority that you're willing to obey and give control over your life. Someone else, yes.
Sorry, just to
Oh,
add,
sorry,
I was just going to say, I think today resistance, the most important forms of resistance is resistance to the therapeutic and resistance to technology, which is really very hard. I mean, I tried not to have a smartphone for years, and you give in eventually. And what my fear is now, I don't use AI on purpose, but my fear is now, if you don't use AI, eventually you will be at a disadvantage. So it's not just an ethical choice. There is immense pressure to use these technologies, and later on, only people with absolute means are able to, like the children of the Silicon Valley overlords. They don't watch screens,
Because
they
their
read.
parents understand.
Yeah, they read. They don't have smartphones at the age of, but your average Joe and Jane and their children, they do. So I think this is something that's probably even harder than what these people did.
Yeah, well, this is something, a point I bring out in the book, Live Not by Lies, is about how the insidious nature of technology to ensnare us and enslave us. Try now going around Budapest and buying something without using your card. You can do it. You can use cash, but everybody uses their card because it's easy. This is the same in America and everywhere else. The thing is about using the card is somebody somewhere has a record of what you bought and when you bought it, where you bought it, and so on and so forth. They can form a profile of your shopping habits, and these data are gathered and sold off by people who collect it online. And they do this in the name of making things easier for you, and it really does. They really do. It's easier to pay with the card. But if we ever get into a situation like in China today, where they have the social credit system, where people will be, the government or the authorities will be able to shut off your ability to buy or sell if you disagree with the government. The fact that we don't have cash anymore, that we're all used to using cards for the sake of convenience, we'll have to pay a very heavy price. Isaiah, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to speak to the key forms of resistance. Anna, I agree. Those are, to me, two of the three. Maybe the third would be a resistance to resentment, which is kind of a weird one, but back to the point of, I agree. I don't want another revolution. I haven't lived through a proper revolution, I guess, but I don't really want to either. And at the end of the day, that's actually where episode 4 goes, so I won't spoil it too much, but to me, this is not a story of political revolution. This is actually, that's the backdrop. This is a story of people who did the right thing no matter what. That, to me, is always the most important thing. We have to keep that front and center in our lives. We have to put, even if you're not going to be in a traditional religion, you have to aim at something. Like Rod was saying, we worship something. And I think even with people who aren't necessarily ready to show up at church, I think living a life of virtue and being a light in that way and saying that there's a purpose to that no matter what, that to me is super important. And one of those, that's resentment. That's saying I'm willing to let go of maybe what happened in the past. I'm willing to be wronged, and at the end of the day, we should stand up for our rights, and we should have debates in public and political parties that, we can support them. That's all fine. But the idea that we can take vengeance on our enemies is very dangerous, and I think it just becomes this horrible cycle. And to me, that's at the core of the revolutionary process, is that vengeance taking and the resentment. And you see that in individual life as well. My parents did the wrong thing raising me, therefore, in some form or another, I need to punish them. What if we just set good boundaries? Absolutely, that's fine. But then forgive them for their shortcomings, just the way that we're going to be asking our kids to forgive us one day. Like, that to me is so at the core of all of this. And I think if we can start at the personal level and then bring it up throughout kind of the broader levels of our communities into our governments, however that works, I don't know. That's a nice idea. And of course, it's more difficult to actually practice. But anything based in resentment to me is dubious and bound for destruction.
One thing Hannah Arendt said is that the totalitarian draws a line between the good people and the bad people. The bad people are the Jews, or the capitalists, or the kulaks, on and on and on. I think the most important thing Solzhenitsyn said in his writing was that he learned in the Gulag that the line between good and evil does not pass between social classes or ethnicities or anything like that. It passes right down the middle of every human heart. And that is a call to be humble and to be merciful to our enemies. You wanted to say something.
So I've noticed a few conflicted messages or moments or during the documentary. So I'm very intrigued. What is your end goal with these books and series? What are you trying to achieve? Like, other than bringing awareness, what else are you really trying to send the message across?
Well, that's a good question. Isaiah, you take it first, and I'll answer.
Rod always punts the difficult
Oh, no,
questions
I'll answer it as you like.
I'm kidding. No, it's great. To me, I would love nothing more. Well, I'll give a quick anecdote. My parents live on the other side of a wall in the same house as my grandparents, and they do not get along politically at all. My grandparents are kind of traditional conservatives. My parents are more on the progressive side, and they have a very hard time getting along on those issues, at least. They've actually watched all four of these together, and they've had some great conversations. And to me, that's a dream come true. If other people could do the same thing, it's not that they each agree with everything and they're all going to be, whatever. But it, especially as the series went on and it pushed more towards, this is what our Christian faith is about. This is what it means to resist in a way that's actually productive. And this is what it means to live a whole human life. These bigger questions, the more that those went on, I think it did allow them to come together at least a little bit and put some of their differences aside and say, let's talk about what's really important. And again, back to, let's not make a villain out of each other. Will this solve every problem they have? No, of course not. But to me, that would be a great objective, is to get people somehow, and it's very difficult, who are on different sides of different things to see that we have a lot in common. And at the end of the day, fighting for truth, it shouldn't be a political issue. I want to live in a place where you have the right to be wrong, and that the public conversation has space for us to debate ideas, and that truth can eventually come to the surface. So to me, that would be one big kind of optimistic goal.
Yeah, and I wrote the book as a Christian writing to other Christians, but the book went far beyond, in the U.S., the Christian community, which delighted me because there were some proper liberals, secular liberals, people like Barry Weiss, who's now a prominent journalist in New York. She's a secular Jewish liberal and a lesbian. We don't agree on a lot of things, but she became a real partisan and a champion of this book because she herself was a brave woman. She worked at the New York Times in 2020, which is the pinnacle of American journalism. If you get to the Times, you've made it to the top. But she quit the Times because she said, we're not allowed to speak the truth inside this building and in the pages of the paper. So she sacrificed her job for the sake of principle. I admire that. I would 1,000 times rather be on the same side with Barry, secular Jewish liberal lesbian, than with people who share my own religion or my own politics, but who are afraid to speak up, afraid of losing their privileges and so forth when they see something wrong. And what I was hoping for in this book was not only to wake Americans and people of the West up to the insidious nature of this new form of totalitarianism. I wanted them to see why it was totalitarian and how we were allowing it into our own lives and to our own consciousness, but also to develop antibodies to it. So in whatever form it may present itself in the future, we are ready for it. And the ultimate goal for me is, as a Christian, is to restore the older view that Christianity has to entail suffering at some level. Not to be defeated by suffering, but to realize that what that old Baptist pastor, Yuri Sipko, said, that if you're not prepared to suffer for the faith, if it comes to that, then your faith doesn't mean anything. There's a great film called A Hidden Life. It's a fiction film made by Terrence Malick, based on the true story of Franz Jägerstätter. He was an Austrian Catholic farmer who lived in an alpine village When the Nazis came to town, everybody in town became a Nazi, except for Franz and his wife. And he resisted Hitler, and eventually the Nazis executed him because he refused to take an oath of allegiance to Hitler. There's a scene in the film in which Franz goes into the village Catholic church and he sees an old artist painting biblical scenes on the wall to adorn the church. And Franz says, "This is very beautiful." The old artist says, "Yes, people always love to come to church to admire the beautiful paintings. People admired Jesus Christ because of the beauty of his teachings. But Jesus didn't call admirers. He called disciples. And you can only tell the difference between an admirer and a disciple when it comes time to suffer." Václav Havel, not a Christian but a humanist, he made a similar point in a great book he wrote called The Power of the Powerless. It came out in 1977. And he tells a story in there. He makes a parable up of a greengrocer. We now call him Havel's greengrocer. Havel said, imagine a case in which you have a greengrocer who's selling vegetables and fruits in a communist city. Like every other small business owner in the city, he puts a sign up in his window that says, "Workers of the world, unite," the communist slogan. Nobody believes it, but they all put the sign in the window to conform and to avoid trouble. What happens, says Havel, if one day the grocer says, "I don't want to live this lie anymore"? He takes the sign down. Well, the secret police come, they arrest him, they seize his business. He has to go sweep the streets for a living. His children suffer. There's a big price to be paid. But what has he gained by that? Havel says he has gained, first of all, his dignity by knowing that he's willing to pay a price not to live under this lie. And other people who see this, who see his act of courage, may be inspired to do the same thing. Eventually, a system that depends on everybody being willing to live by lies will collapse under the weight of truth and the willingness of dissidents to pay a price. Martin Luther King and the civil rights leaders did the same thing in the American South in the 1950s and 1960s. I think in some way you can look at what's happened in the UK with no help from the government. Some feminists, they call them trans-exclusive radical feminists, and people like J.K. Rowling have stood up to this transgender mania, and they're starting to win now. But they were willing to suffer the physical attacks in some case from trans activists, but also brutal attacks in the media and in pop culture for daring to say, no, a man can't be a woman can't be a man. This absurd thing that we were all supposed to believe, and so many people, including many, many Christians and church leaders, accepted blindly for the sake of avoiding trouble and being compassionate. I think we only have time for a couple of more. Dominic.
Wonderful documentary, terribly, terribly thought-provoking. But I can't help but think that this totalitarianism, it really gains huge traction along with the atomization of societies. And, you know, the whole concept of teenagers in their bedrooms, on TikTok, social media, all of that. Just to put a positive note out there, I have friends here who go to some Catholic churches and also some Reformed churches. The big Reformed church in Buda and the Catholic church on the Vatsiutsa, St. Michael's. And when I go there, I'm absolutely struck by how full they are of young people who are incredibly engaged and actually, a not insignificant number, actually know each other. And I can't help but think that strong, engaged, vibrant communities growing from the bottom up, that's got to play a very big part in how we start to roll some of this back. But I mean, just to say, I think it's an incredibly powerful documentary. Can't wait for the subsequent installments.
Yeah, and you can see them all on angel.com when you go home, if you go to that website. Václav Benda, Camilla's late husband, he understood that atomization and the isolation of people was a mechanism of control by the communist government. And so one way he tried to fight back, an apolitical way, was simply to have picnics, to call everybody in the building or the block together just to have a meal, just to see your neighbor and realize that you are living among human beings. Politics never had to come up, but this was a way of doing politics, of reforming a community. Now, we don't have a government that's trying to isolate us so that it can control us, but we're doing it to ourselves by keeping our heads in our phones, on our screens, on our watching television. I remember as a child growing up in the 70s in rural Louisiana, every weekend the families would get together to fry fish or boil crawfish, have a barbecue so the adults could talk and the kids could play. In the late 80s, when we all went off to college or into work, I would go home to visit my mom and dad and notice they didn't do that anymore, because by then, all of the families had satellites on their houses. And even though the kids weren't at home, we were all grown and out of the house, people found reason not to get together. There was always something to watch on TV. Maybe they didn't even like it, but it was almost a vaccination against community. In 2008, there was a terrible hurricane that passed through Louisiana, and it knocked out the power for 15 days in my town. All of the neighbors had to do something that they hadn't done for many, many years, which was come together at night. There was nothing to do in your house but sit in the darkness, so they would light a fire, they would grill meat that was thawing out from their freezers, they would play music, and they would talk. When the lights finally came back on after 2 weeks, my sister, who lived in the town, said, I was almost sorry to see that because it was so nice to be with everybody and just talk. And I had the thought at the time, there's nothing keeping you from doing that now, you know, but it just never seems to occur to people. They went back to their own lives of isolation. Resisting totalitarianism, this passive totalitarianism, requires us to quit being passive, to actually get out and see each other. You don't have to be a left-winger or a right-winger to do that. You just have to be a human being.
Sorry, just to go back to the previous question, just very, very shortly about the general aim of the books and the documentary. I think I've seen referenced very subtly in this first installment, COVID. You know, this is something we've all lived through. This is not wasn't in a faraway country. I mean, it was in all of the countries practically, at least in the West. And you know, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say. I mean, the way I've lived through it was that I saw people comply to a lot less force, a lot more willingly than during communism. People complied. There wasn't that much pressure. You know, there was no pressure of going to prison, maybe losing your job. That's not nothing, obviously. And simply just a sort of mass hysterics. So, and we still don't have a lot of answers to what happened back then. So I think this is one answer to your question, to prevent things like that happening, because they keep happening.
Well, in fact, we know now that the trans phenomenon among young people came out of Tumblr online around 2012, 2013. Activists would get in there and play on the anxieties of young people. And if you're spending a lot of time online, you find a community or a pseudo-community there, and they reinforce each other. And before you know it, these kids are convinced that they are the opposite sex. In a similar way, when I was just back in the U.S., and I met some college professor friends and high school teachers who were terribly worried that young white men are becoming radicalized to the far right and becoming quite anti-Semitic. It's 100% happening because of online, because they're spending so much time online and finding these bad actors. Now, we can and should try to stop these people, stop our kids from following them whenever we can, but more than anything else, we have to take our kids, use what power we have to take our kids away from that and fill them with the truth and with good thoughts and with proper morals so they can have the ability to resist themselves. Last point, Camilla was telling me, Camilla Bendevo, in her house, that the dissidents in Charter 77, all of them read Tolkien, a lot of Tolkien. And Camilla, in fact, would read Tolkien to her children, Tolkien and other authors, for 2 hours a day, every day, even though she had a job. And she said she did that because she knew she had to form their moral imagination, give them something to counter what they were hearing in propaganda in the schools. And I said to her, Camilla, why Tolkien? She said, because we knew that we lived in Mordor. And I understood the genius of what that woman did by reading Tolkien to her kids. These children could not understand what Marxism, Leninism was. All of that was above them. But they could know what the Fellowship of the Ring was. And they can make the analogy between the Fellowship of the Ring and the men and women of all different political parties and religions getting together in their mom and dad's house to fight for freedom. And they planned, I talked to the Benda kids now, they're all adults and have kids of their own, and they talked about the role of the popular culture and that their parents exposed them to. Somehow the Bendas got their hands on a print of High Noon, the 1950s Western with Gary Cooper, and that told them that they came to think of their father as like Gary Cooper, willing to take that risk to stand against the mob on his own. All of these things are formative. And if we are not willing as parents of young kids and teenagers to help them find the good, the true, and the beautiful with which to form their conscience, popular culture is going to do the opposite. Everybody think? John, you want to say something quickly? Wait, here it comes.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, in one social antidote, you got that. Oh, sorry, I was going to announce the fact that seemed to have been lost. One antidote to this kind of risk is, in a way, conversation. And we used to have, in the societies in which we grew up, a whole series of places where people would meet to converse. And of course, they were not necessarily talking about politics. It could be any topic at all. And they weren't certainly, in a sense, organized. It's simply where they met, and conversation was something that then occurred. Now, that's become, as they say, problematic. Because if you live in a society with deep social divisions, particularly social divisions which are not easily eradicated or smoothed over, then it partly is true that the risk of conflict occurs. And it's certainly true that the people who govern us, and I'm not separating any of them here, the people who govern us are worried that we will start to fight each other and be unruly and difficult. I think a Marxist would say they're afraid that the people will get together and realize they're living under a tyranny. I don't believe that. I mean, I think quite a lot of this is well motivated, but nonetheless it happens. This is now reaching the stage in which an institution like the pub in Britain is coming under suspicion. It's not yet come under control, but there is a bill before Parliament which is now being called the Banter Bill, which is supposed to, in a sense, it gives landlords, I believe, people may correct me on the details here, it gives landlords an obligation to intervene and stop banter because it might lead to something worse. Well, of course, sometimes it may and it will. But on the other hand, banning it leads to something much worse than this. It leads to what you're describing. And it does occur to me that the ability to conduct a conversation about politics with people who have different political views, let alone having a love affair with someone who has different political views, these are really important indicators of a good society. And we can't, in a general way, legislate for them. We can certainly stop legislating against them, can't we? And isn't that one of the things that... I mean, I'm terribly sorry to bring policies and practical actions into the conversation, but we have to really become alive to these risks.
Yeah, we do, because what the British government is considering doing, it's all about imposing totalitarian means to keep people from having the wrong thoughts, as we saw at Isabel von Spruce, or saying the wrong words. We all have heard the stories about how in Britain the police are not persecuting or prosecuting actual criminals, but sending their people in to arrest people for having tweeted something obnoxious. But, you know, this is also in personal life. Back when I was living in Louisiana a few years ago, I was sitting around drinking beer with some of my friends, all of us conservatives, and we came to the realization that none of us would go to dinner parties with liberals anymore. Not because we didn't want to be around liberals, but because we had all had the experience of being there, and someone on the left would pick a fight and just blow the whole dinner party up to fight about politics. Now, this is something new because I come from the American South, and we're all famously taught, don't talk about politics and religion at dinner. We have to maintain social harmony. For better or for worse, that's how we are. But people on the left, especially in the age of Trump, became so enraged by the idea that someone wouldn't agree with them that they were willing to blow up a party. And not only that, but record you and put it on social media. That didn't happen to any one of us, but it did happen to others. So we had gotten to the point where we only socialized with people like ourselves, again, not because we only wanted to be with people who agreed, but because certain people on the left had weaponized and politicized the very human space where in generations not too far past, people could come and disagree pleasantly and realize we're still all friends here, right? Anyway, well, thank you all so much for coming. Please stay with us and have a glass of wine. And also, Isaiah Smallman, thank you for joining us from America. Anna.
Thanks for having us.